This building.
And for start, today we are very pleased to have welcome back one of our proud Burb, Master of Urban and Regional Planning Program alumni. And we are working for City of Vancouver. Today, transformation urban transportation innovation in Vancouver, Washington. And I would note that I should make it clear that in this brand new facility, we have a microphone that's supposed to pick up the questions from the audience, but it's so good that it will pick up every noise in the room. So that means every chit chat will be captured and archived on the internet forever. So that. Not sure whether Dr. Mustair, of course, you know, I'm actually reading the presentation seminar for this term. Dr. Mustair is Mustair.
Yeah, so if you're in the civil engineering section, CE 514 or 414, you submit your materials and questions and attendance to me. And if you're in the USP sections, you submit them to like me. You should do that. I think you did the same detail page. I can't figure it out.
It will be separate.
So, and the syllabus, I didn't bring the syllabus.
Okay, great. We will, for those who just for the class, we will hand out the class around the sign sheet for you to indicate your attendance. We don't yet have syllabus. We'll bring one next week.
I posted it on the
detail
site.
You find us on detail as well. And it's basically for those who just for credit, your grade that depends on the tendency and question and the final. So again, if you have any questions, observe that we should get out of the way and
so sign in on the sign-in sheet so that we know you're attending class, and then you have to submit a question to the D2L site by the end of today for if you don't get a chance to ask it. Even if you do ask it, you got to write the question up and submit it to the D2L sites.
Okay. Okay. With that,
thank you, Professor Wayne and Professor Monsieur. As Professor Wayne stated, I'm Anna Dearman. I'm a Senior Transportation Planner with the City of Vancouver, Washington, which is just over the river. I'm also a 2016 graduate of the Master of Urban and Regional Planning program, the Burb program here at Portland State. I was a student in this class not that long ago. So thank you so much to TRAC for having me here. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to those who are tuning in. So I just want to start off. I'm going to talk a bit about Vancouver and then about some of the more exciting transportation projects, plans, and programs we have going on in Vancouver right now. Raise your hand if you've been to Vancouver. Excellent. Okay, I brought candy just in case there are a few of you, but there are too many of you for candy, so that's a good thing. Raise your hand if you have used transit in Vancouver. Very cool. Awesome. Biked. Very cool. Does anyone live in Vancouver?
Right there.
Cool. Yeah, it's changed a lot, I'm sure. I both live and work in downtown Vancouver. I live about 2/3 of a mile from City Hall where I work. And so much is happening in the city. It's a fascinating sort of case study for this region as well as suburbs around the country. And so I'll talk about a few specific projects that we've got going on right now, specifically Complete Streets program implementation, which really involves sort of roadway retrofits, as well as a bus rapid transit, and our Waterfront, which you may have heard of. just a little bit about Vancouver. Like I said, it's on the northern side of the Columbia River, part of this Portland, Vancouver, Hillsborough metropolitan statistical area. So it's part of this metro region. It is Chinook and Klickitat land. It was founded in 1825. Our fort, which is a really important symbol of our community, was founded as a trading post for the Hudson's Bay Company, and was a site of some really significant wealth in the region. The city was incorporated in 1857, so as a settlement, it is actually older than Portland, and it is the original Vancouver. As of 2018, we're very proud of this. Since the new statistics just came out, our population is about 183,000. It's the second largest city in this metro, and it's the fourth largest city in Washington state. Only Seattle, Tacoma, and Spokane are larger than Vancouver. So we're a major player, both in the region and in the state. We also really see ourselves as a model for addressing and sort of developing solutions for metropolitan issues. So, for example, if we can figure out transportation in Vancouver from Vancouver to Portland, if we can figure out that bottleneck, that would be sort of an amazing contribution to the region's connectivity as a whole. As my supervisor would point out, if we can figure out some issues in Vancouver, then air quality in North Portland would improve. And so it's a really interesting, like I said before, case study to sort of test out regional solutions. So with the transportation class, you are probably interested in things like our mode split in Vancouver. This is a comparison also using the 2018 census data that just came out of mode splits between Portland, Hillsborough, and Vancouver. These are the three largest cities in our region. So Vancouver and Hillsborough are both suburbs. Our mode split is pretty similar. And then obviously pretty different with Portland in terms of especially active transportation. Sees a lot higher usage in Portland. And I should make the disclaimer, census data, especially around transportation, as you all are likely aware or will become aware over the course of your studies, is really imperfect and somewhat problematic in that it's only capturing commutes, and it's just not capturing sort of the entire picture of what transportation mode usage looks like in our communities. I'll also say in terms of commute flows, I know Vancouver has a reputation that all of us who live there work here in Portland, but actually a significant population in Vancouver both lives and works in the city. And then it's also a regional destination, people coming from north of the river, south of the river to work there. And so you can kind of see this comparison. It's actually pretty even.
Sorry, we have some feedback that you're a little hard to hear.
I'm sorry.
If we can adjust this maybe if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try and put it this way, so let me turn your head.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, everyone.
That's all right.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, we'll see if that helps.
Yeah, let me know if it doesn't get better. So yeah, you can see sort of the comparison. Vancouver is pretty equal in terms of where we live as compared to where we work. And then just for context, in the MSA as a whole, it's pretty much contained in terms of commute flows. So I'll move into discussing some things that we're working on right now in Vancouver. One of the biggest sort of programs that we are now implementing is our Complete Streets program. You're probably familiar with some of the concepts of Complete Streets. This is a really big sort of initiative that a lot of communities are taking on right now for a lot of reasons. This is one community in California depiction of what complete streets look like. We like this. We aren't sure where we stand on shared mobility right now, and so I would make that disclaimer. But this is kind of how Vancouver conceptualizes complete streets. So we're looking to make it safe and comfortable for people of all ages and abilities to get around no matter what mode they choose or what mode they're able to use. And that's pretty typical for complete streets policies. some of the specific goals of the policy are, again, to improve safety and accessibility and just general mobility. And that's very multimodal, sort of in nature, to fit the dynamic and character of each neighborhood, which can get very interesting. This is an inherent tension in our policy that I would really urge you all to consider. And it's really played out in some project controversies that I'll get into later. Another big element of Complete Streets is that it opens you up for funding opportunities. Our Complete Streets policy scores really well with the National Complete Streets Coalition, which in part sets us up to receive additional grant funding from our state and other sources, in that we have a policy, a really good policy, and are trying to develop a track record of implementing this policy. So literally where the rubber meets the road with our Complete Streets policy is on a project that we have been working on pretty recently. So this is kind of an interesting project. It's a really good example of sort of the planning process and sort of the unique role that transportation planners play. So one bit of context, at the City of Vancouver, I'm a transportation planner. I sit with our Community and Economic Development Department. So I sit with our long range planners. At PBOT, for example, the planners and the engineers are in the same organization. So our engineers of the City of Vancouver are in public works. And so it's just a very different sort of structure. And then the unique role of transportation planners is that we are both developing plans and policies to these visionary, sort of long range documents, and then we are also implementing projects. So we are reviewing literally construction contracts. And so that's complicated, and it creates a lot of sort of challenges in terms of implementing a policy and sort of these interdepartmental dynamics, but it's a really great opportunity as well. So with the West Side Bike Mobility Project, this project was born out of a plan called the West Side Mobility Strategy, which identified a balanced mobility concept. It's a multimodal plan that looked at basically a segment of our city, west of I-5, sort of encompassing our downtown, our ports, and some of the older neighborhoods in Vancouver, sort of our inner neighborhoods, and identified how does freight get around, how does it impact the neighborhoods, how do people bike around here, what does driving look like when you've got sort of massive congestion on Interstate 5 trying to get into Portland in the mornings. And so one of the recommendations that came out of that strategy, all this is very typical of plans, right, is we need to identify and implement a better network of bike routes. So this strategy, the West Side Mobility Strategy, was adopted the year before our Complete Streets policy, which means that at the time this strategy was adopted, our standards for what a bikeway looks like were completely different, right? Because things like protected bike lanes, neighborhood greenways were sort of not part of our lexicon at this time, and certainly were not sort of the standard that we would have held ourselves to at this time. At the time we passed our transportation system plan, our very first transportation system plan in 2004, we then rapidly implemented lots of bike lanes. But as we know now, bike lanes may not necessarily feel comfortable for everyone who may be interested in riding a bike. And so after our Complete Streets policy passes in 2017, we then go to implement the bike component of the West Side Mobility Strategy starting last year in 2018. The big goal of this project was in identifying and sort of refining our network in this area of bikeways. We would then implement, so construct, at least one of those. And so the goal would be to get a better understanding of the network, better definition for the network, but also put a route on the ground. That was very goal. Didn't play out exactly like that. So this is very typical planning, almost sort of technocratic process. We gathered lots of data traffic speeds and volumes, counts of people biking and walking, roadway dimensions, geometry. We looked at more qualitative data around our neighborhood action plans. Our consultant did a level of traffic stress analysis for the existing sort of bikeways or the existing road network. We did have some share roads and some bike lanes in this area, but they didn't necessarily meet sort of the least stressful kind of criteria and ranking for bikeways. And then, of course, we conducted outreach activities. In fact, more extensive outreach than the city had really ever done before. We tried to meet people where they were, at events, at our farmers market, at our Waterfront grand opening last year, at various neighborhood gatherings. And then we got a better understanding through all of that work of what should our network look like, which corridors, which alignments are on the table. And then we developed sort of alternatives for those alignments and also design concepts. What would it take to make this particular corridor feel safe and comfortable for people of all ages and abilities, that interested but concerned sort of population? These are all sort of jargony terms, but sort of the industry. What would it take, what would it look like on this particular street for these people to feel comfortable? And so I should just lay it out there. Sometimes that involves removing parking. This is a major, major controversy, and that certainly is how it played out in Vancouver. So there was one street, and I'll get into this in a bit more detail on the next slide, but there was one street that really emerged. It's sort of the currently designated bike route. It's the one people want to use. It gives people access to the most destinations they say they want to go to. It provides only access to the I-5 bike path. It is narrow, most unfortunately, and it is also busy, and the speeds are higher. And so in order to make it feel comfortable, it would really need something like protected bike lanes in order to sort of meet our complete street standards. And there's not enough room to have both protected bike lanes and parking on this street. And that was a major controversy. So again, I'll explain a bit more about the controversy on the next slide, but basically what happened, we went to our council several times about this project. The community was super engaged, also sort of shared their feedback with staff and council, and we were directed to form a community advisory committee for the project. And so that's the phase we're in now. We're basically kind of narrowing it down to, let's just figure out sort of a multimodal solution, maybe more visionary for this more constrained group of streets, which are kind of in the vicinity of this most controversial corridor. This is also in part driven by our paving program. With a constrained funding landscape, a good opportunity to implement projects can be when you go to resurface streets. And so one street on the table is scheduled to be resurfaced originally last year, now next year, 2020, originally summer 2018. And so we're really trying to figure out if anything's proposed for this street, we need to get plans by March 2020 so that it can go to construction in the summer of 2020. Just another sort of piece of context. What street is it? It is Columbia Street, if you have heard of it. So the Columbia Street controversy specifically revolved around the fact that this street, from our objective and then our qualitative analysis and also the public outreach, this street really emerged as the street that people were interested in biking on. Again, based on sort of the technical analysis, it would need protected bike lanes to feel comfortable. Because of the constraints, you would have to remove parking in order to implement protected bike lanes. And that is super challenging for the community, understandably. And another sort of criticism we received was that our public outreach was inadequate and ineffective. And, from our perspective, this is more effort than we've ever put in to public outreach. And yet, I'm here to tell y'all, it is still not enough. And it's completely legitimate that people receive a postcard and they recycle it. And the postcard shows parking, and we are proposing to remove parking. And that all just became very sort of challenging and contentious within the community. They created their own sort of, they look like parking tickets and would put them on people's cars to notify them of the project. Perhaps that's a better strategy. So these are all things we're kind of thinking through as we sort of evaluate our lessons learned from this project and just really the public outreach in general. And so one best practice for especially contentious projects is sort of forming this community advisory committee. And we're really excited about the potential for this phase, this process, to be a really interesting, really effective example of sort of deliberative democracy. And I'll get into a little bit more of sort of the opportunities and challenges of that. But it's a process that a lot of communities have used to really engage folks in an authentic way. It's super time consuming. It makes you question sort of your role as a planner. What technical sort of expertise do I even bring to this process? But our role is really to convene and to facilitate the community's sort of shaping of their own neighborhoods. And so to that end, with that goal in mind, thus far we found it to be a pretty effective process. So again, these are some of which I've already articulated, but our main takeaways from this project thus far. This project is still in development. As I said, we're in this community advisory committee phase. But these are things that I would tell other suburbs or other communities. We are going through growing pains in Vancouver. We are seeing a huge influx in our population. People are being displaced from Portland because it's expensive and they're moving to Vancouver. At the same time, in Vancouver, our rents have risen. At one point a couple of years ago, had risen more than any other city in the country. And so we are experiencing a ton of interesting dynamics as well. We've got this world-class waterfront. Our downtown is super enjoyable, has been sleepy for years. And so change is hard. And that plays out in very real ways in our work. Another important takeaway for us, these are things that we would implement next time on the next project. We really need to acknowledge project trade-offs up front. That doesn't mean that everyone will sort of key into that and engage and that you will avoid controversy. We don't believe, because sometimes, at least as we found with the West Side project, the fact that so many people were sort of upset also meant that so many people were engaged and are now engaged on this project, which, you know, is a good thing. Specifically around community advisory committees, they lend transparency to the process, and I think a very authentic way of empowering and engaging community. And we're hoping that the community will feel really sort of bought into this process and will ultimately end up championing sort of recommendation that they develop, and that will have sort of advocates for this new corridor by the end of this process. Another sort of lesson learned from the West Side project is, say you have a bike project that's kind of incomplete in some ways, right? What are all their multimodal improvements that are related and can enhance this corridor in a more holistic way? So, for example, on our committee, we have several folks who have disabilities or who work with people who are disabled, and they've helped us realize the sidewalk is my street, is my transportation network. And so to consider this corridor and not to consider what improvements we can make, and not to consider the impacts of, say, a protected bike lane on someone who is disabled, who needs to get from their car to the sidewalk, who cannot use a bike, that's incomplete. And so this sort of process is also really nice for enabling us to take a more holistic look at improvements to a corridor. So that was the West Side project. Another really exciting project that we've got going on in Vancouver right now is bus rapid transit. So we have the very first bus rapid transit system in our region. The next would be sort of the division bus rapid transit system here in Portland. So C-Tran is our transit agency, and just a couple of years ago launched bus rapid transit on sort of the corridor in our city with the highest ridership, which is a really good way to sort of implement bus rapid transit to address some challenges that they were seeing with the service. And since that time, they have already increased ridership significantly and have reduced delays significantly. And so it's functioning as an efficient, effective, frequent transit service. Along what I should say is our corridor with the most transit-dependent population. So it's a really wonderful amenity in our community. It's somewhat of a hybrid BRT system. Often BRT will have dedicated lanes, maybe center running. This system does not have a dedicated lane. It runs in the same travel lane as drivers use. And other than that, it is pretty similar in that it uses stations instead of bus stops, uses these long articulated buses and level boarding platforms. And so you're not having to step kind of into the street or off of a curb ramp to board the bus. You board just sort of at grade. There are challenges to implementing these projects that'll go into sort of on the next slide. One that we continue to face that is pretty frustrating and continues to sort of, I think, just kind of delay expansion and implementation of this project is just the general stigma around transit as a mode and people who ride transit, which is just really unfortunate. So in implementing the Vine, which is the name of our bus rapid transit system, on Fourth Plain, the first corridor that was implemented in 2017, we've learned a lot of things about how to work with our transit agency, how to develop these projects as a good partner. Basically, surprise, the funding landscape for transit is super constrained. And there are ways that we as a city can be a good partner and support our transit agency in the overall sort of system enhancements. Maybe we can go after grants targeted at improvements for people walking and biking to help support bus rapid transit. Maybe we can expand our multifamily tax exemption area to encourage transit-oriented development. Another thing that is not so much a transportation effort, but is really relevant. Our Fourth Plain corridor, as I said, is where our most transit-dependent populations live in Vancouver. It's also our multicultural district. It's also an area where we're really concerned about gentrification and displacement. And so to that effort, to that end, a couple of MRF workshops pretty recently have been focused on this corridor. We're in the process of implementing the findings from those projects. And specifically, we are trying to sort of further anti-displacement efforts in this corridor. Specifically, we're trying to figure out how that relates to transit-oriented development. So we want to support transit-oriented development. We're concerned about the potential of TOD to displace people. How can we mitigate that in Vancouver? I should also say Vancouver is really interesting in that we don't have the same sort of history as Portland. We have not had redlining in Vancouver. We have not had the same sort of dynamics of gentrification and displacement in Vancouver. And so we have an opportunity to kind of get this right and to prevent some of these negative outcomes. All of this is not to say that we don't have really serious issues with racism and gentrification and sort of negative economic dynamics in Vancouver, but we also have the chance to try to, again, avoid some of these negative futures. So kind of stepping back a bit, to that end, given this context, though the funding is sort of constrained to make this the perfect, the most pure BRT system, the city can partner with the agency, again, to look for ways to sort of enhance walking and biking and these transit connections in the corridor. And our largest takeaway from Fourth Lane is that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that is true of a lot of major transportation efforts in the region. I know some people have those sort of takeaways from, bridge efforts and things like that. It's just important to remember. We can mitigate some of the negative outcomes of these hybrid systems. Just a few examples of things that have been kind of raised successes on the Vine specifically. Has a really innovative way of loading your bike. I just used it yesterday. It's almost too easy. It's confusing. It's pretty cool. And then this summer they had concerts on the Vine, so there was live music. And just anecdotally, I use this system a lot. It is always full, and it's just a pretty wonderful, again, amenity in our community. So, given the success of the Vine on Fourth Lane, C-Tran is looking to implement the Vine on another major east-west corridor in Vancouver, Mill Plain. This time with the same constrained funding landscape on a corridor that is 4 miles longer. My supervisor and I were just discussing this morning, they have to make a 50% local match, and so it's just really, really challenging. We're going to have to be really thrifty sort of with this project. And so what are some of the things we can do to make this a success, to make this really good, if not perfect? One thing that we kind of wish we had done more last time with Fourth Lane was to consider sort of station and station area enhancements. So, for example, when you put a station in the sidewalk area and don't sort of increase the right-of-way, so purchase additional right-of-way, your station then becomes the sidewalk, creating conflict for people who just need to walk or roll on by. So what are ways? This image on the bottom right is a concept from Division BRT, which would increase sort of the right-of-way, or if it's already available, make use of it to put the sidewalk behind the station. We're considering things like bikes behind, having the existing bike lane on the corridor perhaps go behind the station so as not to create a conflict between people biking and people boarding or alighting from the bus. And again, we're looking at some of the tools that we have, grant pursuits, projects to enhance the multimodal context around the BRT, and also sort of the housing, sort of economic development, amenities, sort of context to make transit-oriented development accessible and effective. So the Vine on Mill Plain is ongoing right now. We distribute 30% plans. Locally preferred alternative process has already been completed. And so if you are interested as a transportation professional in weighing in or just learning more about the project, it's ongoing. So then just to finish out our waterfront, has anyone been to the waterfront? Cool, okay, what did you think of it?
Awesome, it's really amazing. It makes Portland's waterfront park look sad.
Thank you.
I mean it sincerely as someone who loves our waterfront park and has been using it for 30 years. It's just absolutely amazing what you guys did up there. That rope or sail thing, that was pretty, my son loved it. We spent a couple hours exploring it.
Cool, yeah, that's great to hear, thanks. So this pier, Grant Pier, is cantilevered, so it's a masterpiece of structural engineering. It's pretty cool. This is a world-class facility. In our eyes, it's won awards from Oregon. We're really excited and proud of it. It's also been just a really great model for how to get massive projects done that we are already implementing and seeking, for example, major upgrades to transportation corridors in other parts of our city. Just a few facts about it. It was a paper mill before, so a lot to sort of clean up around this site. The city and partners, Graymore Development, our port, members of the community, created a master plan for the area. This has been ongoing for probably around 20 years now. Certainly the recession impacted sort of the progress. The vision is that it would have about 3,300 residential units, about 1 million square feet of office space, and significant retail space as well. And a lot of that retail is open. We have a really cool pub with sort of serve your own beer. So you can get a card and go up to the taps and you pay by the ounce. So it's pretty cool things to check out if you're into that. Great burger place, Mary Hill Wine, Outpost. So it's already very sort of enjoyable, even though really sort of a small portion of it, 7 out of, I believe, 35 acres is developed as of right now. Probably a little bit more than 7 because 7 is just the parkland. So the first thing to open was our public park, and it's been just this fantastic amenity for our community. This water feature is super, super cool. It's on this image. It sort of simulates the Columbia and then the tributaries, and has a really interesting write-up about just sort of the meaning of water in our culture. Truly like the write-up on that feature, gives me chills. It's just really interesting sort of thing to think about. So I highly encourage you to visit. You can take the bus. It's fabulous. You can also take the MAX to Delta Park and then take the bus to downtown. So one component of getting this massive project done did relate largely to transportation. It was called the Waterfront Access Project. It had a really impressive public-private investment ratio. This means for 1 unit of investment, the return was times 30, so pretty amazing. At that time, the transportation element was about 38.6 million, and given the amount of jobs and tax revenue, that would generate 238.1 million. And we could have used this example to analyze the potential positive impacts of upgrading First Street on the east side of our city. We're pursuing a federal build grant for that project, and it's also similarly this hugely impactful project, but again, sort of major investment, major just resources, staff resources, to kind of get these things off the ground. So specifically what the work entailed, we had to reconstruct a railroad berm. The railroad kind of goes right through the waterfront area. We extended a couple of streets from downtown to the waterfront, and then we closed an at-grade crossing to make the area safer and more accessible. In the bottom right is a depiction of what our multi-use path through the waterfront looks like, and on summer day is completely that busy. It's pretty exciting. So other things going on in transportation in Vancouver, just to close out. We continue to implement our Complete Streets program, like I said, largely through roadway retrofits. The controversial projects are just going to keep coming. That's how it is, given sort of the constraints, lane use and transportation context in our cities, as well as constrained funding. We've got to do the best with what we have. That's kind of our MO now. To that end, we are updating our 15-year-old transportation system plan. That's a 2.5-year process that will kick off here soon. We're really excited about that. We're also going to be developing a Transportation and Mobility Commission, so a formal advisory commission in our city that would advise, similar to like a planning commission, would advise staff and also council on transportation-related policy plans, projects. We are considering a micromobility pilot. This will be the first task of our Transportation and Mobility Commission to really think about what would scooters, what would e-bike share, what would any of those things kind of look like in Vancouver? Is this a good idea? What are the concerns that we want to mitigate? I mentioned the Southeast First Street an East Vancouver sort of build grant pursuit. This is in an area of Vancouver with a lot of high wage jobs and a lot of potential for really innovative mixed use development. And so that $24 million project just for a street, it's a farm to market road right now. We wanted to have world-class biking and walking facilities where the sidewalk would be separate from the off-street bike path. So we're really excited about opportunities there. We may end up with some extremely complicated and fabulous roundabouts with this project. And then we're also going to do a parking occupancy study for basically our downtown to get a better understanding of what are the demands, what are the pressures, and what might we do to sort of make this resource work better for everyone. So what I would tell other suburbs as it relates not only to the West Side project, what I would tell other communities, there are things we can all learn from each other. These would be the key takeaways from what I've shared with you today. As a suburb, we are urbanizing. We have some of the same issues as every other suburb: connectivity, access, land use and transportation dynamics. Those are inherent to every community. We experience growing pains, change is hard. This is reality. I feel like we also kind of need a therapy session around it, really. Community advisory committees are potentially a really powerful tool for sort of investigating some of these projects. I would say what I'm finding, just really candidly as we go through this process, is I feel really sensitive about the fact that other people have other jobs and occupations. They are not planners, and that's by choice. And we're asking them to do a lot in engaging with us this deeply. 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock p.m. meetings, 2 more times a month. It's a lot. But it's, again, I think really empowering. And then with our Transportation and Mobility Commission, we're really envisioning that as sort of the appropriate advisory body, given sort of the scale and the scope of our transportation projects, plans, policies, programs in the city, would be a great sort of body to consider these things and to advise not only us, but also our city council on these matters. With that, this is my contact information. If you have any questions, like to know more about Vancouver, thanks again for having me.
I will let you pick your questions. Just raise your hand.
You know the blue scarf?
Yeah. I was just wondering about the advisory committee for the bike project. Was that something that only happened because there was controversy about parking? And what do you feel like you learned from that about the circumstances in which it's appropriate to create an advisory committee?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So the question was, for the Bike Project Advisory Committee, did that only come out of this controversy around parking, and what did we learn about sort of the circumstances that would make an advisory committee appropriate? Great question. So before sort of the controversy emerged, we did kind of ask the question, do we want to have an advisory committee? This is something that other communities have done. Ultimately decided it probably wasn't necessary given sort of the scope and scale of the project. And so, yes, it probably would not have happened without this controversy and the need to kind of mitigate that and engage the community sort of more deeply. That being said, in the future, so we'll have this sort of ongoing advisory commission that could receive any type of transportation project, but we'll certainly be asking the question in project development, would an advisory committee be appropriate to this project? And I think what we're thinking right now is that there's some opportunities with that. In some ways, say that controversy or that level of interest isn't already there. When we formed this committee, we held an application process and got 50+ applications for 15 to 17 spots. And so there's a lot of interest, a lot of demand, and sort of participate in this group. what if we don't have that? And then what if it still becomes controversial? And so these are things we're kind of thinking through. But I would say we've created these committees for other types of non-transportation projects, and they've been effective in those settings as well. It's definitely a tool we'll continue to use and would recommend.
Can I piggyback a little bit off of what you were just talking about? I guess I was wondering about the formation of the advisory committee, and how did you ensure that the composition of the committee reflected the diverse composition of Vancouver?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how do we form the committee in terms of ensuring that it had sort of diverse representation of different populations in Vancouver? And so this particular project was somewhat site-specific, and so we didn't require that folks lived like in the affected neighborhoods, for example. But in the application, we stated a few sort of representatives that we were looking for. So a neighbor from this particular neighborhood, a neighbor from that particular neighborhood, people who biked, people who drove, people who owned businesses in the corridor, representatives of different established organizations, so a business association, a neighborhood, coalition, people from different service providers in the area. So our Veterans Assistance Center is on the corridor. We wanted representatives from that group. We were really hoping to have representation from our housing authority and school districts, who are also kind of in the impact area. So yeah, we sort of stated we are looking for folks to identify in these different ways. But it was very sort of community-based, if that makes sense. And it was definitely specific to the context of these neighborhoods. Sorry, that's a question. I'll go to
I'm a civil engineering student, and we've been learning a lot about what PBOT is doing to kind of challenge the status quo and like generally assumed ideas about parking and driving. And from your presentation, it sounded a little bit more like letting the community decide what they want. And I was just wondering how, like, if Vancouver has such a smaller bike neighborhood, like what does that tension look like in between trying to like promote deep streets, but is there like the enthusiasm base for it? And like I don't understand maybe the tension between listening and maybe trying to challenge the status quo.
That's a great question. So the question was around, on the one hand, you want to listen to the community and respond to the community. On the other hand, maybe you have this sort of expertise or sort of goals, maybe policy objectives to challenge the status quo, and how do you kind of reconcile that? Is that kind of the question? So that's a great question, and definitely something we've been grappling with as part of this process. If we just respond to the community and just give them what they want, so to speak, then number one, what is the purpose of our expertise that we bring to the situation? And also, what's the future of our community going to look like? And so I think it's definitely a balance, and continues to be a balance. And it's part of how I feel like I'm kind of questioning, like, what is my role? What expertise do I bring to the table other than convening and facilitating this process? Because, I think a point I didn't really articulate, people don't trust data and don't trust the expertise that we bring. And, their perspectives, their lived experience is completely valid. And so I think there's definitely there has to be sort of this negotiation and sort of shift in paradigm. And I'll give an example that's been really interesting to me recently. So you all are probably familiar with the concept of like a road diet. So for example, say you were to implement a road diet. This is something I learned from planners at Oakland who are doing amazing things around equity. And so say you would implement a road diet in a corridor that has or people of color or people of lower income, then are you just shifting the goalpost for them? They believe, the car is our upward mobility. Being able to drive, being able to get around, that is, how we frame success. And you're telling me that the bike or whatnot, this thing that is a symbol of my stigma is the goal? Like, that is moving the goalpost for me. Does it mean that road diets aren't great for safety? Not necessarily, but it does kind of give you pause, like maybe this should look somewhat different. And so I think it's an ongoing dance, an ongoing negotiation between sort of standards and expertise and data, and also people's lived experience and what will work for your community. And in our policy, for example, we've kind of given ourselves that freedom in that we've said, we want to make sure this fits the dynamic and character of each neighborhood. And so it's context sensitive. It may not look the same in every place, and it has to be kind of negotiated. It's not a very satisfying answer. It doesn't feel satisfying on the daily.
It can't be wrapped up in a bow probably, but
No.
that was great.
Yeah, sorry.
You've touched on this a little bit about different controversies. You were saying removing parking is a controversy, and now you're saying shifting the goalpost is a bit of controversy. I was curious what other type of controversies you've come across with new projects, like conditions on the sidewalks, that the property owners are responsible for the sidewalks, not the city. I mean, what other issues you have to deal with as these new projects go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, what other controversies sort of are out there? You mentioned the example of property owners being responsible for maintaining the sidewalk. That's definitely an issue in our community. We just did sort of sidewalk inventory and are developing a sidewalk prioritization process. But then the onus is potentially on the adjacent property owner to repair the sidewalk, which, as I've stated, is some people's street network is a super critical sort of resource in our community. I don't know that I would say that has been so controversial. For the West Side project, for example, we looked at, if you put in protected bike lanes, you have to remove parking, you also have to remove turn lanes. And, is that going to cause delays? Is it going to cause queuing? Is it going to cause cut through? That was a big concern. In Vancouver, and I don't know if this is the same everywhere, but there is a really strong interest in traffic calming. In Vancouver, we have a really interesting traffic calming program. And so I think not so much controversy, but really common ground is where traffic calming comes into play. Everyone can kind of agree, the streets feel busier, it feels like people are going too fast. That's a place where people can really come together around solutions. So that, I think, is controversial in the sense that it's an agreed upon sort of issue citywide, but it's also a place of agreement, so to speak. There are multiple other controversies. I really doubt any is as big as parking. That's a maybe not untested hypothesis. We've got people from over here. In front, yeah.
I'm Sarah. I was wondering what kind of data do you use to determine which corridor to update?
That's a great question. So the question was, what data do you use to determine which corridor to update? So that's interesting in that it can come from so many different sources. So for the West Side project, for example, we had this, existing sort of plan, but also our council passed a strategic plan, sort of where they wanted to see the city go between like 2016, 2021, and they called out a few specific corridors. And so council direction is a big sort of source for project priorities. So you could consider that sort of data by way of public input or input from your elected officials or sort of direction from your elected officials. In terms of actual data for prioritizing streets and just sort of hard objective data, for the West Side project, for example, our consultant looked at all kinds of things around crash history. We just did a citywide safety analysis, which can provide a really interesting way to prioritize grant funding pursuits for projects, just priority projects to address. So safety is a big one, and that would look like sort of crash history as well as safety risk factors. So if we look at our crash data, then are we seeing sort of anomalies that are maybe unique to our community in terms of are more pedestrians involved in these crashes? Are they occurring on roadways posted at 35 miles per hour, and we only have a few roadways posted at that speed? So these are patterns that sort of require further analysis and sort of emphasis. All kinds of data though, but I wouldn't say that all sort of project prioritization is based on data.
So then the crash history would be like 10% SPIS or whatever program you use?
Something like that. It would be maybe, you suggested 10% SPIS. I believe that's Oregon specific. So in Washington State, it would be something like, for this type of crash, our fatality, severe injury rate is much higher. So we look at something like that for crash history potentially. I read in the back.
We have time for one last question.
You mentioned the evaluating like the dynamic and the character of a neighborhood in the Vancouver kind of like city philosophy. I was wondering if that was referring it kind of sounds like referring to like the culture of a place, and I was wondering who is said to like evaluate that.
That's a great question. So you mentioned in our Complete Streets policy, we have this goal of fitting the dynamic and character of each neighborhood. Who determines that? That's a really great question. So specific to the West Side project, the way that this has kind of come up, it's in, what's considered sort of a historic neighborhood. Some of these homes are 100 years old. It was developed at a time when cars didn't exist. People walked, rode horses. And so given our sort of auto-centered culture now, what does it look like to fit the dynamics and character of that neighborhood? And a way this plays out is there are alleys serving these homes with garages. But are those garages large enough to fit modern vehicles? If they are historic, then is it more challenging to upgrade those to meet sort of the needs of modern storage, again, modern vehicles? If we require, or if we try to sort of encourage off-street parking in this neighborhood, does that mean that there are more curb cuts and that's impacting the sidewalk and impacting sort of access concerns for the roadway? And so who determines it? In our experience with Westside, it's the community members themselves, and that's part of engaging them in this sort of advisory role. But it would definitely, yes, address sort of culture and look different sort of neighborhood by neighborhood. I think our goal would be for it to really sort of authentically come from the community. Do we have time for?
We are out of time. We're
Out of time. So, yeah.
Thank you all again.
All right.
Thank you.
So again, if you are a student in the class, we just confirmed that the C2L site is shared between the USP and the CE students. So you can go in there and on the intent or in the weekly questions for week 1, type in your question. We'll collect the attendance sheets and then enter those. The syllabus is posted on there as well. Attendance is 50% of the grade. Weekly question is 10%, and the final paper is 40% of the grade. There's also instructions on how you can watch some of these online. If you can't attend in person, you can watch online, but you have to watch online, but you have to watch live. So you have to sign in to the streaming archive and send a note that you're attending, and then send your question before the webinar ends.
Do you want it to specify for CE or USP?
No, you're all in together in this. So
Right.
So yeah, I know, we'll know. So, and the last thing is if there is a students in transportation, engineering, and planner, faculty, staff, mixer in the atrium of the Carl Miller Center.
Yeah, by the Cocoa Donuts or the Broadway side.
Pizza and salad, it says.
Yeah, it's pizzicato, it's good stuff. I'm gonna go set it up. You guys should come. Free food.
All right, thank you.